"I speak 9 languages," Maya said, her voice quiet but steady, her wrists cuffed and the metal cool against the skin of someone who had learned to keep her hands steady under pressure. The magistrate laughed in a way that sounded like a judge tucking amusement into procedure, as if skepticism were a sport and she had shown up with the wrong equipment. Papers rustled, camera lenses clicked, and a prosecutor in an immaculate suit placed a stack of invoices and canceled contracts on the bench as if that weight alone would close the story. Accused of fabricating a resume to secure paid work translating diplomatic reports for an international relief agency, Maya sat in a narrow courtroom beneath a high ceiling that let in a thin winter light, the smell of old coffee and copier toner mixing with the cold metal of authority. Her family waited in the gallery, shoulders bowed, while reporters muttered a headline that had already spread across social feeds. "Translation fraud, local woman exposed." "You claim to have credentials you do not possess," Prosecutor Allen said, his tone tight and surgical, a narration already written in the public appetite. "What proof do you have that you can do what you say?" Maya looked slowly at the magistrate, at Judge Parker, at the rows of faces that expected a confession, and answered with the same simple calm she used when correcting a subtle idiom to make it fit a community's voice. "Give me 3 minutes, and I will show what the paper does not show." A murmur passed through the room. That promise would not be idle. Outside, a retired teacher clutched a yellowed certificate. A former colleague scrolled through a message that smelled of secrecy, and a whistleblower inside the agency tapped a code word into a secure chat. An elegant woman in a navy coat who had once been an ambassador in another life and now carried a sealed dossier rose from the back and met Maya's eyes. The change was not instant, but it was the first tilt in a room built to resist tilt. If you think you know how this ends, sit with the discomfort for a moment, because this is not only about a resume. It is about how institutions decide who counts as credible and who is disposable, and that decision will be undone in ways the court did not expect. If this story matters to you, subscribe for more cases where proof turns the tide. The accusations that filled the next hour read like a ledger of disbelief. The prosecutor presented contracts marked nonconformity, emails flagged by automated compliance checks, and a list of clients who, when contacted, reported dissatisfaction. "There are timestamps missing," Allen insisted, pointing to a spreadsheet with highlighted cells. "There are signatures that do not match corporate records." He named the agency, the project number, the budget line for translation services, and the clause about accreditation. He used words that sound watertight in a chain of custody, verification, accrediting body. The headlines outside recycled the language: unlicensed translator, fraudulent billing. In the gallery, June Alvarez, a librarian who had first encouraged Maya to teach in the community center, clenched a photocopy of a recommendation and felt outrage gather like a storm behind her ribs. Kareem Noor, who had subcontracted work to Maya years earlier, sat forward and tapped his foot against the floor, the sound sharp. The initial tone was condescending, as if the lack of stamped diplomas equaled a lack of skill. "You see," the prosecutor said to Judge Parker, "this is about due diligence. We cannot allow individuals to pretend to have the institutional endorsement that protects state-level cooperation." The magistrate nodded, a movement more administrative than humane, and the narrative of institutional risk took shape. Maya listened, small breaths, the metallic tang of adrenaline in her mouth. She had expected the worst, but she had not expected them to be so certain without looking farther than the front page of her own file. "They have contracts and a log of complaints," Rosa Martinez, her appointed counsel, said under her breath. "We need to show context." The courtroom smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The acoustics made voices bounce like small stones, and the tissues in the hands of Maya's sister left bits of paper dust on the pew. Calmly, Maya shifted the focus. "This is not about a stamp," she said, voice soft enough to make people lean closer. "This is about translation as a living bridge, not a certificate in a drawer." The contrast stung the prosecutors, who had rehearsed a checklist. She asked instead to read aloud one short passage she had translated for the relief efforts 6 months before, a passage that had been criticized as too colloquial by a junior reviewer at headquarters. The judge hesitated. "You will not create new evidence on the spot," Judge Parker said in a clipped tone that suggested process, not curiosity. "You may present documents through counsel." Maya nodded and let her lawyer file a motion that seemed, at first, procedural. The air held a tension like a string pulled taut. The small victory was procedural permission, a sliver wide enough for demonstration if they could push. In that pause, the room tasted of dust and possibility, the fluorescent lights humming like a held breath. Rosa Martinez whispered strategies. Elena Rossi, a former auditor in the agency, blinked and tapped a note under the bench, and a former colleague, Karim, mouthed a line of support. The scene contained dialogues, each exchange a small negotiation, 10 or more shifts of claim and counterclaim, and with each line Maya planted doubt like seeds. When the first witness stood, the atmosphere changed. Dr. Samuel Hart, a linguistics professor with a reputation for precise ear and an easy cadence, walked to the podium carrying a slim folder that did not look official, but contained something heavier than paper. "I was asked to examine the translations," he said. His voice carried, crisp as a ruler cutting air. Elena Rossi leaned forward and tapped a message into her secure channel that began the quiet ripple of the whistleblower network. The professor described his methods with calm authority, explaining how he had compared idiomatic alignment, cultural markers, and pragmatic equivalence across the documents, and how a statistical signature in certain phrasings indicated a native level of intuition. He mentioned a dossier compiled by an independent committee and a set of annotated notes from field partners that described how Maya's phrasing prevented miscommunications that had previously led to lost funding. The court listened to him explain, in accessible terms, what a linguistic expertise looked like, and he offered to read, in the 3 different languages, excerpts that matched the field reports. The room smelled faintly of rain coming through the vents. A sensation of shift moved across the gallery, like a tide noticing an unexpected current. In the crowd, Ambassador Claire Dubois, who had once overseen contracts in Brussels and now carried a seal of credibility, rose and presented a stamped letter confirming that a remote internal review had relied on Maya's translations in a crisis situation. The judge rubbed his temple, an almost human gesture, as the neat boxes of accusation began to look porous. Names slid into the narrative. Dr. Samuel Hart reading, Ambassador Dubois placing documents, June Alvarez holding that old certificate, Karim checking messages, Elena whispering to Rosa. The first reveal had arrived not as theatrical flourish, but as layered testimony that forced a recalculation of plausibility. The labels the institution used were intact, but the meaning had begun to change. Behind the scenes, an investigation moved like clockwork. In a cramped, rented office, Rosa Martinez convened a small team to comb through email headers, metadata, and invoices. "We need chain of custody, not hearsay," she told Karim and June, and an intern named David who tracked timestamps and attachments. They found an email thread that contradicted the narrative of nonconformity, an offhand message from a project manager that praised Maya for clarifying a culturally sensitive passage. The team uncovered a pattern of internal notes that suggested the complaints were triggered not by incompetence, but by bureaucratic discomfort with uncredentialed labor. A former employee, Marcus, turned whistleblower, provided screenshots of a private chat where senior staff had discussed preferring vendors with the right names for the optics of donor meetings. The discovery smelled faintly of old coffee and recycled smoke. They documented everything in a growing file labeled simply with Maya's initials, assembling it like a surgeon arranging tools. The names added to the rotation. Marcus sending a printout, David forwarding a chain, Karim contacting field partners, Elena confirming receipt of a sealed audit. The investigation felt less like sleuthing and more like slow, patient accumulation. Each email another bead in a chain that would have to be snapped to break the accusation. The public exposure happened at the next hearing. It was cinematic because of the precision, not because of theatrics. Rosa placed an annotated timeline on the bench, then projected, within the court's permission, snippets of messages and audio clips that had been authenticated by a neutral forensic analyst. A technical explanation accompanied the display, brief and clear, 292 characters long, saying that metadata verification included header analysis, timestamp correlation, and hash checks to confirm document integrity and chain of custody. The projection showed a WhatsApp exchange where a team lead had written, in private, that a senior executive had insisted on choosing a vendor with names that reassure donors, and an internal memo advising caution about hiring community translators without formal degrees. The room saw the same whispers that had circulated in private now blown up into readable text. The prosecution tried to counter with claims about unsigned invoices, but their counterattack faltered when a field coordinator, Ana Torres, took the stand and described, in a voice layered with heat and humidity memory, how Maya's translation had prevented a misinterpretation that would have delayed food distribution. "I remember the sound of the phone," Ana said, "how it vibrated against my palm when I called to confirm the wording, how the relief worker cried when she heard the phrase translated in a way that made the request clear. That sensory detail sat in the air like a drop of oil on flat water. The audience felt texture again, the papery rustle of the documents, the scratch of a pen, the taste of stale air, the warmth of a memory of a truck arriving on time." The prosecution's narrative of fraud began to lose cohesion as factual layers accumulated. The exhibit list grew, and each item added weight, an avalanche beginning at the size of a pebble. Then came the demonstration that would tip the scale, a deliberate performance that used the only thing a court could not easily discount, namely, demonstration in multiple linguistic registers. Maya had asked to be allowed to translate live a short emergency briefing into 3 languages, each chosen because of the local dialects they reflected. The judge reluctantly permitted it. The room hushed. Even the microphones seemed to hold their breath. Maya stood, palms slightly damp, and began. She rendered the emergency instructions with a rhythm that matched the cadence of listeners. She chose metaphors that a coastal fishing community would recognize. She softened a technical clause that elsewhere had caused confusion, and made a verb choice that had saved a sentence from sounding like an accusation. In rapid sequence, she read the same passage in Spanish, then in a coastal Creole, then in a regional indigenous tongue with cadences so precise that Dr. Samuel Hart's eyebrows lifted. In the gallery, Ambassador Dubois closed her eyes as if confirming an internal earmark. A hush followed, not empty but heavy with motion. Reactions came in waves, a look of disbelief from the prosecutor, a sharp intake of breath from Judge Parker, a soft sound like paper folding from June Alvarez. Someone in the press box whispered a translation out loud, and the echo made words feel larger. The demonstration had at least 10 exchanges of call and response with the court and the witnesses, and each exchange expanded the texture of the moment, carrying 5 to 6 sensory notes. The warmth of a remembered radio, the roughness of a translated term, the click of a pen, the smell of rain through the window, the metallic of the cuff in contrast. After Maya finished, silence stretched long enough to be recorded. Then Dr. Samuel Hart stood and validated her choices, calling them irrefutable markers of native-level intuition and pragmatic competence. For the first time in the day, the judge did not have a script to fall back on. The immediate resolution came quickly once the technical proof, witnesses, and live demonstration aligned. Prosecutor Allen, faced with a chain of corroborated emails, an ambassadorial letter, multiple field testimonies, and a live performance beyond staged claim, conceded that the original narrative needed reconsideration. Judge Parker, uncomfortable but compelled by the weight of verified evidence and public attention, ordered a withdrawal of the immediate charges pending a formal review, and suggested a mediation that would reassess procedures rather than court punishment. The courtroom reacted. There were apologies, awkwardly worded but sincere in the moment, from a deputy who had earlier pushed for quick charges. The agency that had commissioned the contracts announced an internal audit, and a mid-level manager who had been named in the leaked chats resigned from a coordinating role pending investigation. Social feeds that had begun with scoffing now flooded with a different phraseology: proof, repercussion, accountability. The viral clip of Maya speaking in 3 languages peaked with captions that read that this was not about paper, but practice. The immediate fallout included offers for Maya to consult on inclusive credentialing practices, and a call from a rights law firm offering support for a claim regarding procedural discrimination. The people named in the margins of the story moved from the periphery into public scrutiny. It was messy, it was human, and it was palpable. 1 month later, the litigation had shifted from criminal bait to institutional audit. The agency published a preliminary report acknowledging lapses in their vendor vetting process and promising an overhaul of credential review that would include skills-based assessment. Marcus the whistleblower was granted temporary protection while the internal investigation continued, and Rosa Martinez filed an administrative appeal requesting formal recognition of non-traditional accreditation pathways. Maya returned to her community center, where June Alvarez greeted her with a basket of home-baked bread and the smell of yeast and celebration in the air. She began holding workshops where she taught translation as cultural mediation, not just literal transfer of words. Within a month, she had trained 10 local translators who had previously been overlooked for formal work, documenting their progress with samples and field testimonies. The public conversation had shifted. Hashtags that once mocked now trended with stories of overlooked expertise and calls for reform. 3 months later, the agency announced the formation of an independent review board that included community representatives, linguistics experts, and a liaison from an international human rights office. Ambassador Claire Dubois joined the board as an external advisor, bringing a network that helped ratify a new pilot program to hire community translators through skills-based assessment and supervised apprenticeships. Kareem Noor took a position coordinating field testimonies, ensuring that feedback loops from beneficiaries were formalized into procurement criteria. The audit revealed that at least 3 major contracts in the previous year had been affected by similar biases, and as a result, the agency revised procurement language to require demonstration-based proof along with, or instead of, exclusive reliance on institutional degrees for certain categories of fieldwork. 6 months later, the consequences had taken on measurable shape. The agency published a public accountability dashboard showing outcomes of the new policies, noting a 20% increase in hires from local communities for translation and cultural mediation roles and a reduction in miscommunications that had previously delayed aid disbursement. Rosa Martinez had helped found a small institute that certified practical linguistic competence in field contexts, and June Alvarez had been hired as a community liaison to that institute. Marcus received a formal acknowledgement and a small stipend for facilitating transparency. Maya had been invited to consult on an international standards committee for non-traditional credentialing, and had accepted a role that allowed her to train and recommend local translators for multilateral contracts. The legacy included a concrete number of professionals whose careers had shifted because of one courtroom demonstration, and a shift in language used by donor agencies from gatekeeping to verification. The moral was clear without being preachy. Systems can change when evidence meets pressure, and when communities are given the tools to speak back. If this story moved you, leave a comment with a brief example of someone you have seen underestimated by credentials alone. Type yes and 1 line about what happened, and share this video to keep the conversation going. If you want more investigative narratives that combine documents, testimony, and real consequences, subscribe. In the end, what began as a scene of humiliation turned into a case study in institutional blindness and correction. Maya walked out of the courthouse months later carrying a small stack of contracts and a proposal to train translators in pragmatic competence assessments. The agency revised its procurement policy, the audit led to staffing changes, and the community received recognition that translated into work and stability. It was not tidy, it was not instant justice, but it was a practical transformation. Proof had shifted the narrative, and the people involved saw policies change because they were compelled to finally listen. The smallest details remained vivid, from the metallic chill of the cuffs to the warmth of the bread at the community center, and they reminded those who watched that credibility can be more than a stamped paper. This episode left a trail of names and actions. Dr. Samuel Hart, Ambassador Claire Dubois, Rosa Martinez, June Alvarez, Kareem Noor, Elena Rossi, Marcus, and Ana Torres all played parts that altered outcomes. If you believe in stories that hold institutions accountable and lift up talents that do not fit a narrow mold, subscribe and share. Justice, in this story, was not a verdict alone, but a change in procedure, a new institute, and the reclaimed dignity of people who had always spoken but had not always been heard.